If memory serves me correctly, I think I was here 2 weeks ago. I think the provincial has not informed me that I've been transferred here. But in any event, as Father Bill mentioned earlier, the little topic for meditation for today's novena in this week of the Novena of Hope is the new Evangelization and St. John the 23rd. I will come back to that in a moment. But as I often do, I would like to begin with a little bit of a story. It's a true story. One of the things that I have learned and am continuing to learn in life, I suppose you might call it, it's one of life's little ironies, or maybe it's one of life's little paradoxes, whatever. But the lesson is this, that sometimes in those events in our lives that are rather dark and that are sometimes negative and that are even sometimes rather painful, that very often these can be the moments when somehow or other God's love and God's grace manages to peek out. And if we're honest with ourselves, it strikes me that sometimes, perhaps even more often than we like to admit, it almost seems as if God is playing a little bit of a game of peekaboo. Sometimes we don't always see God's grace or feel God's grace, but then there are those moments when suddenly it peeks out, and sometimes those moments are rather painful moments. And at the risk of dredging up a memory, and it's not just a memory because in a perhaps diminished way we're still living through it, I would like to go back to 2002. I'm sure many of us remember that 2002 was the year that the so-called priest scandal came to light, which had, for whatever sets of reasons, its epicenter in the Archdiocese of Boston. And even though we don't like to think about it, the truth of the matter is, I think that for Catholics in the United States, and certainly for many priests, it was a somewhat painful time. I know, for example, of one priest friend who had shared with me that he was out one day walking on the streets with his collar, and someone literally came up and spit on him. This was not a happy time for the Roman Catholic Church in the United States. But the story that I really wanted to share is something that happened at that time to me. I was celebrating Mass not long after this scandal broke at the parish where I usually help in New York, in Flushing, New York. And Mass was over, and I was standing in the back of the church greeting the people as they came out. And to be honest with you, because of what was going on, I was feeling a little bit awkward and a little bit distanced from the people through no fault of their own. It really was more my fault. I mean, for one thing, I have been coming here long enough and preaching long enough that I think that some of the congregation here probably knows certain things about me. For example, you know that, at least in part, I am from an Irish background. You know, I am not what you would call a touchy-feely person, and certainly not a huggy-kissy person, all right? We did not do this in my family, and my sisters and my brother, I think, would back me up on this. In our family, a wave and a handshake went a long way. There was never any hugging, and as Garrison Keillor said, if there was, it was certainly never full frontal hugging. You didn't hug one another that way. You waved. That was sort of the way that we were. You know these things, I think, by now about me, because I talk about myself at times in the homilies more than Donald Trump does, which in fact is a lot. I was in the back of the church. First of all, not being kissy and huggy to begin with, because of whatever personality quirks and Irish background I've inherited. But I was standing there greeting the people. And as I was greeting the people, you know, I was dressed like this. I had the vestments on and the whole schlemiel. And I'm standing there, and suddenly I feel this energy wrap itself around my legs. And I looked down, and there was this little kid, this little guy. He could not have been more than 4 or 5, or maybe a very small 6-year-old. And he had come up when I wasn't looking with his parents, and he had wrapped himself around my legs. And he wouldn't let go. I looked at his mother and his father, and I think that they could see the panic in my eyes, you know? And his mom said to me something that obviously I haven't forgotten and don't think I ever will forget. She looked at me and she said, I think he felt you needed a hug, you know? I think he felt you needed a hug. Now, to be quite blunt with you, as I've said on other occasions, I do not want to romanticize children. I've taught elementary school full-time. I've taught high school full-time. I have monitored recess lines and yards. I know what they're capable of, you know? But the truth of the matter is, because they're young, they're closer to birth than they are to death. And therefore, I tend to think that they're still very close to God, and that they have intuitions that sometimes for all of us as adults, every once in a while, it would be a very good thing for us to pay attention to them. And the truth of the matter is, I think this little guy's instincts were probably pretty good. And the truth of the matter also is that if we are honest with ourselves, that as individuals, as a church, and as a world, every once in a while, and maybe more than every once in a while, we need a hug. And the reason why I'm mentioning all of this in a meditation on, you know, Pope St. John the 23rd is that in many ways, John the 23rd was somebody who reminded people, and he reminded the church, and he reminded the world in his own time that it needs a hug. And that in Jesus Christ, that hug is given us by God. And we call that hug good news. I don't want to bore you with a lot of details. But believe it or not, I actually did do some research before I came. And I read a couple books on Pope John, and I actually read a couple books of his quotes. And I'm also aware that in the United States, only 10% of Catholics now are what we would call pre-Vatican II Catholics. In other words, only 10% are still alive who remember what it was like before the Second Vatican Council and what it was like at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council. And Pope John is responsible for this. Pope John was born in 1881, and he was elected Pope in 1958 at the age of 76. After 11 ballots, which should tell us that the cardinals didn't know what they wanted. To be quite blunt with you, and to put it in the layman's terms, they elected an old geezer that they thought would do very little damage to the church. That in a sense, he would be a caretaker. And as soon as he was elected Pope, he announced that there would be a Vatican Council. And his advisors even tried to sort of say to him, well, we can't start it until 1964. The Pope went ahead and said, no, it's going to begin in 1962. Because the Holy Father knew that his time was limited. And it was John the 23rd who, in a sense, as we sometimes said, provided this aggiornamento. He sort of wanted to bring the church into the 20th century and wanted to remind the church of the fundamental good news that has been given to us, and that good news has something to do with the love of God that comes to us in Jesus Christ, our Lord. The truth of the matter is, actually, there's a little conundrum here. Pope John the 23rd never said anything about the new evangelization. That term wasn't coined until 1979 with Pope St. John Paul II. John the 23rd never used this phrase, though he did talk about evangelization. But one of the interesting little things that John the 23rd did spend a lot of time talking about was holiness. That as Catholics and as Christians, we are called to be holy. And I am not here simply talking about goodness. While goodness and holiness are related, they are not identical. But John the 23rd spent a lot of time speaking to the issue of holiness. You know, back at St. John's several years ago, I had a student in class. He was not a Catholic. He was an evangelical Christian. But he warmed up to me, and we spent a little bit of time talking. He was a very good person, and I learned a lot from him, probably more than he learned from me. I learned, for example, the importance of the letter of St. Paul to the Romans for Christianity. But in any event, we would sit and we would talk, and he was very good, but he suffered from one little fatal flaw. He not only was very good, he knew he was very good, you know? And one day we were sitting and we were talking, and he was singing that song we sometimes sing, I'm so good, why isn't everyone else as good as me? You know? And we were sitting in a bench in the great lawn of the university at St. John's, and as he was saying all this, I finally looked at him and I said, you know, no, so-and-so, you're right. You really are very good. Unfortunately, what you are not yet is very holy. He looked like I punched him in the stomach. And to be honest with you, I think I must have had a pained look because, you know, being the type of Irishman that I am, I'm very rarely that forward with people. I prefer to be passive-aggressive, you know? And he's looking at me, and I think he's looking for an answer. And I looked at him, and I said, well, here's the difference I would make. You will begin to know that you are becoming holy when instead of saying, I am good, and why isn't everyone else as good as I am, you begin to say, there, but for the grace of God, go I. And when you stop judging other people so rashly and so harshly. And to be blunt with you, this was very easy for me to diagnose because I suffer more often than I like to admit from the same condition. I am like him. So I know what I'm talking about in this regard. But the truth of the matter is the saints are not holy because they are perfect. Quite the opposite. The saints are holy because they are imperfect and they know that they are imperfect, and the only thing that they can do is entrust themselves to the mercy and the grace of God and to be patient with themselves and to be patient with others. In one of his daily papal messages, John the 23rd once began to talk about holiness, and he said that holiness consists in patience, compassion, and forbearance. To be patient with one another and yourself, to be compassionate towards each other and yourself, and to bear with yourself and one another when we don't always live up to the demands of the gospel, which more often than not, we don't. And in that same little message, the Holy Father said this: Jesus did not say to us, "Learn from me, for I am the Son of the Heavenly Father." He did not show us how to create heaven and earth or to clothe the sun in its mantle of splendor, but how rather to be meek and lowly of heart. This is the very foundation of goodness. When we understand the secret of goodness and have made it our own, we shall have found the surest way of overcoming the difficulties and failures of our earthly life. As Paul said in yesterday's second letter, the transgression is not like the gift. The gift is much greater than the transgression. And in Jesus Christ, the grace of God overflows, even when at times we are not all that we should be. This is the good news. Every once in a while, we need to be hugged. The church needs to be hugged. The world needs to be hugged. But John the 23rd also reminded us it's not simply enough to wait to be hugged, that we and our church have to also hug each other and hug the world.